what a day! What a lovely day!
Hey guys, welcome back. This video we're going to start working on the scales and liners, and we're going to kind of fit the scales to the tang and all that kind of good stuff. So starting off here, super easy, super basic, just tracing the tang onto the carbon fiber and tracing it onto the toxic green G10 that I'm going to be using for the liners. This is a super basic thing. It doesn't have to be anywhere near exact. You just kind of want to get the basic shape. As a matter of fact, you want it to be oversized a little bit. That way it's going to be easier to line up all four of these when you clamp them down onto the knife and go to drill the holes through them. So it gives you a little bit of room for error, margin for error. And again, I want to remind you, this is not an instructional video. I am going to cut out a lot of stuff that's redundant or super boring. And so if you were trying to make a knife based on just watching this, you're going to miss a lot of stuff that I did or that I went back and did again. And you're going to go, why does my knife look like shit? Because you were following a video that was not meant to be instructional. So here all I'm doing is just cutting everything out on the bandsaw. Now I can speed up the bandsaw from when I was cutting steel. At steel I've got mine set at 160. Here I've probably got it around 350, something like that. I can buzz through this stuff a lot quicker. Generally I will batch my knives out to where anything that's going to be done with carbon fiber, those knives will be toward the end of a batch. I'll make sure that all of my steel is cut. I'll make sure any more delicate or precious materials that need a very sharp blade are already cut. And carbon fiber is generally the last thing that will be cut on any bandsaw blade that I have because it dulls it super, super fast. Here I'm not being as safe as I probably should be. As I had mentioned in the previous video when I was drilling the tang, you want to lock all of your work into your drill press vise to make sure that the blade doesn't get, snagged by the drill and start doing the helicopter, which will slice you open and cause all kinds of damage. But I'm trying to be as safe as possible. I'm using the 1, 2, 3 blocks here because they're completely flat and completely true, and as long as I have my work pressed down flat on that, the holes that I'm drilling through the scales and the liners will be completely straight and true and parallel to the knife, so I don't have anything to worry about. So I've just got the scales clamped onto the tang of the knife. That keeps them from moving around. If I'm using a material that tends to snag as it heats up when the drill goes through it, a lot of times I'll drill the first hole, then I'll put a pin through that hole along with those vices to make sure it can't possibly move. Here I'm going to counterbore the outside of the scale so that I can sink my titanium hardware down into it. And I have my counterbore set into this one particular drill press. That's all it gets used for. It never changes. I have my table height set exactly where I want it. I've got my sacrificial G10 material here at the exact thickness that I need so that it goes down and counterbores into my material the exact depth every single knife. The only variance I have is if I have a knife like this knife that's going to have liners, I have a piece of liner material right here that I can then put under my sacrificial G10, and that gives me the exact additional depth that I'm going to need. Generally, I only use 30 or 60 for thickness on my liners, and I have a piece of material in each thickness that allows me to do this. It's perfectly repeatable from knife to knife, and I never have anything to worry about. In case you're wondering, I buy all of my drills and all of my counterbores from McMaster Carr. So if you're a knife maker and you're looking where to get that stuff, McMaster Carr. Your drills should always be carbide. Always, 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 always. Here, I've just basically got these screwed all together so I can start shaping it around the tang. And all I'm using, are old titanium pivots that have either gotten scratched up over time or couldn't otherwise be used. so that I'm using the same material that I'd be using to screw the knife together during final assembly. I'm going to start here with 60 grit to hog off a lot of the excess material. What I don't want to do is get down and start carving into the steel with that 60 grit, because you've got these random larger size grits sporadically throughout the belt, and that can carve deeper ruts into the steel. It can also take chips out, especially of those thin liners. So I just want to get it mostly close, 95, 98%. And then what I'll do is take this 120, and generally a worn 120, a well-used and well-loved 120. And then I'll bring it down flush with the steel, because before I heat treat, I'm pretty much going to keep everything around 120 grit on the perimeters. So there you see right down there on the underside of the handle, that's now nice and flat to the steel. I'm going around the ass end of the knife right now, right around the butt, the booty. And so I'm going to go all the way around at 120 just to clean everything up and match those parts together. Does not have to be perfect, because after I heat treat, I have to go back and then take all the heat treat coloring, or if this were carbon steel, you'd want to take the heat treat scale off of all of the surfaces of the knife. So I'm still going to have to go over this again, and at that point I'm also going to have the scales on there so that I can match everything up that I'm doing. But this gives me a nice clean look of the knife, gives me an idea of how it's going to shape out, and then I can start working on the frame, the scale tips and all that. Using my belt cleaner right there to kind of clean some of the buildup out of the belt. That's how you help your belts live a little bit longer. Anytime you get buildup, or you just want to have a clean belt. Like I have bright green liners on here, right? I don't want a bunch of carbon fiber dust getting into the G10, that green G10, that light color, as I'm grinding it, because it's going to embed itself into it, and you can't clean it out. You just have to grind through it again. So every now and then, use your belt cleaner, and that doesn't resharpen your belt, but it reduces the buildup and it helps it feel fresher for a little bit longer. So I'm going to leave you now a little bit quiet here so you can kind of watch as all this goes on. Worth adding, you don't want to press too hard when you're using a contact wheel, because it's going to cause the belt to kind of billow a little bit, and what it's going to do is it's going to push in harder to the softer outside surfaces, which in this case are carbon fiber and G10, and not cut away the same amount of material in the steel. So what you'll end up having is steel poking up all the way around, and you'll actually feel the outer edges of the tang of the steel, and your parts aren't going to mate up. So you don't want to push too hard here. A lot of times what I'll do, and I didn't do on this knife because I was recording, is I'll actually use my flat platen up to about 220 grit. And I can push as hard as I want, and everything is perfectly mated, perfectly flat. And then I'll touch up and take out those scratch marks from the grinding with the contact wheel set up horizontally like this. But for the sake of time, I just went ahead and did it this way, because it's already time consuming enough dealing with recording all this. I don't know how people do this and do like full-on instructional videos and stop for every single step. This took me twice as long to make this knife because I was doing this recording and setting up the camera and getting focus and stopping and starting again. I'm never doing this again. It was a huge pain in the ass. In here with a small wheel right up where the spine meets up with the harpoon at 220 and then 400. The smoother your surfaces are prior to heat treat, the better. You're obviously going to smooth them out again after heat treat. So you've got a lot of work to do, and I like to make everything as clean as possible at all times. Oh man, this is how dead my brain is. I'm glad I put text up here on the screen. I had completely forgotten that we had done the heat treat in the last video. So yeah, I am applying finish work here. I'm sorry, I just got finished in real life finishing the knife today, and luckily it wasn't over 100 degrees today. It was only in the 90s. So I'm exhausted. I'm on painkillers from my neck and my cervical spine. So yeah, okay, so I'm doing the full cleanup now after the heat treat has been done. So my steel is nice and hard. I don't have to worry about cutting away too much of the steel by fitting the scales. A lot of times I will fit scales to an annealed blade if I'm super duper careful. I do prefer to do it after heat treat though. That way I don't screw up. I don't end up with a handle that's way smaller than it should have been because my dumbass cut into the steel as I was shaping the handle material. I did that once with desert ironwood, not realizing how hard and dense desert ironwood was. It was, I think, one of the first times I'd worked with it. I'm thinking, oh, it's soft like some of the other woods that I use. And I was having to dig into it so much that I was cutting into steel at the same time and didn't realize it, and ended up with a handle that was too skinny. The knife got thrown away. The $130 handle material got thrown away. That was a bad day. So anyway, we're going through the belt progressions here. And so we've done the 60, the 120, the 220, 400. 400 is a good, nice, clean satin finish. I love 400 grit. And if it's done well, it's going to be perfectly acceptable on pretty much every surface. On this knife, what I ended up doing, and you'll see it, I think, later on, I don't remember if I recorded it or not, is I went back over everything with a fine gray-green Scotchbrite, and that brings you up somewhere around in the neighborhood of 1200 to 1500, but it's not a bright. Like if you were to actually go through belts up to 12 or 1500, it'll be a very bright, shiny finish. With the Scotchbrite, you've got that high grit finish, but it will be a soft satin, a little bit lower on the reflectivity. Here's 600 grit. So basically you're going around the entire perimeter of the knife, everything. One thing I've never heard anybody talk about is your edge. I will always go across where the edge of, there's the Scotchbrite belt right there, shebang. That also, again, I'm glad I put the text up there, that will also soften all of the intersections where each of the different areas meet. Especially right back there on the spine, you know, where I met those two and I kept it nice and sharp. This gently softens it. You've still got some definition, but there's no sharp edge there. Anyway, back to the edge. Where the edge is going to be of the blade, I don't leave that rough cut at like 60 grit or something, because again, it could be very, very choppy. It could almost be a serrated edge. So I always go up to 400 grit. That way, once I've ground everything down to the edge and I put the edge on, the actual edge that's there was not, there weren't tiny little bits missing out of it. It was a nice, smooth, very, very clean finish. There we see how the Scotchbrite belt does. Nice and clean, beautiful satin finish. Still going to go over it by hand, but this gives me a little bit less work to do later on. See, there I am, going over it by hand. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I went back to 600 grit with the sandpaper here. And all I'm really doing is, if there was any at all, any of the spine that didn't go down quite as far or grind down quite as far as the scale material, by using a soft backing, which is my thumb in this case, it will gently round it out. Not enough to where you're going to feel it and go, oh, this is like a crowned area. Not so much. It just softens it just a little bit in case there was a little bit sticking out there. I also like to clean up my finishes and make them uniform by hand. That's just the way I am. Machines are great, and if you're confident that you can get a great finish right off your machine, by all means, go for it. I've just gotten to the point now where every single thing I do has to be done by hand, at least at the very end of all the processes. So that's why a basic knife like this is still good. I've got about 12 hours into this build. Obviously, it's very condensed for this video. My God, how long? How boring would a 12-hour long video be? Jesus. Even 12 1-hour long videos, I'd want to plunge this knife into my sternum. So yeah, I put a lot of time into the knives because I always want a hand finish on everything. And just because I know somebody's going to ask in the comments section what this particular vise is that I'm using, these are no longer made, unfortunately. It's called the Red E Hand, R-E-D, then E, and then hand. And this thing was pure genius. It will move in innumerable different directions. You could do handle work, you could do blade finishing, you can do anything that you can imagine from any position. It was pretty phenomenal. They were like 300 bucks, but well worth it. And there is what your scales should look like mated to your tang. Hand finished, looks great. Now I'm not done yet because you'll notice the scale fronts don't have my signature crescent, my Devil's Moon crescent that I do at the scale tips. So I'm gonna have to later blend what I do there in with what I've got here, but it's only a little bit of touch-up work. And here you can see I've drawn on just the basic form. I'm always going to kind of freehand it, and it's going to depend on how far I know I'm going to pull plunges back on a certain knife, or how much room there is on that particular pattern. So I just kind of draw a little template for myself, and then I fine-tune it for each and every knife. You would never be able to take one scale from one knife and put it on the exact same model on a different build and have it match up. It cannot happen because everything is just kind of how I do it. Just kind of freeball it, baby. And so here I'm using my smallest of my small wheels to cut in the inner portion of the crescent. On this, I'm using my Vashti grinder, my Vashti Rise. I love this grinder. It's a fantastic grinder. Costs a lot less than my TW90. What you can't see is to the left of this is my other Vashti grinder, my Rift, which I just got. Doesn't have a motor on it yet, haven't set it up yet. I cannot wait to start using that grinder as well. So, just doing the insides of the crescent here. I generally start with 120 on carbon fiber. That'll usually cut well without burning the material up. And that's the basic shape right there. It's still going to get a lot of fine tuning. And what you don't see in this video is I ended up having to go back and refine tune it and change the proportions just a little bit to fit this particular blade after I ground it. Because I really wanted to do sweeping plunges on this particular knife. I wanted it to be very dramatic in the grinds. Because hey, I'm showing off for YouTube, right? So I changed some of the dimensions on the scale front. So here's what I was talking about before, where I'm blending what I've just done with the crescents. What happens is there's going to be a harsh line in between where I ground the scales down to the tang and to where the Devil's Moon kind of meets up to it. So I want to soften that. I also taper the scales downward from the spine just a little bit in this process. And that exposes a little bit more of the spine, but I soften that later on. I didn't used to do that. Now I do. It's something that I've learned that customers really appreciate. So once I blended it with the belts, then I do it with a Scotchbrite pad in my hand, and it's still not 100% done there, but
that's what I'm
that
talking
harsh
about.
line is done. There we go, nice and smooth, blended really nicely. I still ended up going back over this again later on, but this gives you an idea of how to blend that, or how I blend it, I should say. Okay, fun stuff here. We're going to start setting up for surface grinding for the final time. The reason I do it in this order, I go ahead and I do all of my outer perimeters first, and it can sometimes leave a little bit of a burr that you'll feel on the sides or on the flat surfaces. So it's best to do all that first and then go back here and surface grind to get rid of all that heat treat coloring. And it'll also deburr that very, very tiny little burr that may be there. It's not always there, but sometimes. Depends on how much material you're taking off and how hard you're pushing when you're doing it. And that will clean it up. I don't know why I banged into the camera there. I'm not used to having a camera behind me. So this gives a basic finish. I stopped with the A45, which is roughly a 400 grit finish. And you can see the difference between the heat treated side there that I haven't done yet and the side there that has been done. I see a lot of people using a surface grinder and trying to pull finishes out of it. It doesn't look good. People can tell that it's a machine finish. You're still gonna have to go back. I'm not gonna say you have to. It is better if you go back over it and do your hand rub for the finish, because if the customer is paying money, they should get the best finishing possible. And that's, again, what's going to set you apart from everybody else making knives, and what can make knives that you may charge $200 for turn into a $300 knife, or a $400 knife into a $500 knife. Here I'm going back and touching up the forward finger choil by hand to smooth out any little facets I may have created with the small wheel as I was smoothing it and rounding it out. This, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is a 400 grit, then I'll do a 600 grit, then I'll do the Scotchbrite all by hand, and that smooths it out, removes the faceting, and also gives an equal finish to the rest of the perimeter of the knife. All right, yay, fun stuff. Generally, whatever grit you come off with from your grinder, it will make your life easier if you step down a grit. So if you come off a 400 grit equivalent belt, dropping to 220 will knock off all those high spots a lot faster. Here, I felt the finish was already pretty much clean, so I went and started with the same grit at 400. You see those black lines in there? That's the ripples I was talking about before. When you use a surface grinding attachment, or if you have a nice big fancy surface grinder and you have converted it to run with belts instead of stones, those are the ripples that are there that you don't know are there until you go to do hand finishing. Then you see how exactly not flat that actual surface is. So I always tell people, I see people go, oh, how do you do a belt conversion for this massive surface grinder I've got? I'm like, don't. You're actually lessening the efficacy of the machinery that you've got. Use the friggin' stones. They're far more accurate. Because even being as gentle as you want to be, you're still running on a soft contact wheel, even though it's a harder contact wheel. It's that serrated wheel. It's still rubber that you're pushing up against, and the belt coming around, the seam coming around gives you belt bump, and it creates those ripples. So I have to spend the time eliminating those by hand, and it ain't fun. So there is an acceptable clean finish. I think it looks really, really good. That's a 600 grit hand rub satin right there. In a second here, we'll take it over to some better lighting, and you can see much, much cleaner. And it does not have to be perfect, because The only thing I'm finishing here is the flats and ricasso. I'm getting ready to grind the blade. So I don't have to have it perfect down where the bevels and the swedges are going to be because they're about to be ground completely away. But I do want to make sure that the finishes on my flats and ricasso are as close to perfect as possible. Now we're going to go over and do something that, man, until I learned a good workflow for myself, I would always screw up and forget about and end up doing this at the very end when I should be assembling the knife and finishing it. Here we're going to flatten the backside of the scales. Here's where I'm going to be using my granite surface plate. Granite surface plates are a must-have in every knife shop, period. You're going to use this for a multitude of tasks. Here I'm just using a very light glue that can come off very, very easily. That's going to keep my paper from sliding around and also keep it from curling up. You can use a light mist of Windex and lay the paper on there and it'll keep it from moving around, but it might curl up when it gets wet enough. Now, if you look really close, you'll see gaps between the carbon fiber and the green liners because the carbon fiber is not perfectly flat on the backside. Now, it's not too bad, so I don't have to go down to 120 and then go up to 220. I can just do a clean 220 on there, clean up the back sides. I'm going to draw little lines on here so that it's easy for me to tell when I've removed all the material I need to remove where everything has been touched, so everything is perfectly flat. If you have any low spots, that will create gaps. So this is just easier than trying, I don't know, guessing at everything. Draw the little lines on there with the Sharpie, and when they're all gone, bada bing, bada boom, you got flat back sides, yo. I like to lubricate the paper with Windex, just so that it makes things a little bit easier and cleaner and makes the sandpaper more effective. You're always going to do everything in a circular motion. Figure eights would be best, but what I do is I just do circles in both directions, then I flip the scale around and do the same exact thing, and that basically gives you the same thing as figure eights. That way you're not applying too much pressure with your thumbs more than your fingers, and everything will be flat, but they won't be true. So you won't have everything perfectly square, and that really sucks too. So I don't want to take a lot of material off. Remember, I've already counterbored these scales to the depth that I want them at. So I'm not taking a lot of material off here, just enough to make everything flat. There's a little low spot that I detected, so I've got to sand all the rest of it down to be as low as that low spot. When that's done, I know that everything is perfectly flat and there'll be no gaps between the carbon fiber and the G10. Knife making 101, folks. The most important thing about knife making is that everything that you touch is flat and true. Flat and square, always. Because if anything's not flat, it's going to create issues later in the build. Every single time, whether it's a fixed blade or a folder. Way worse with a folder, but still very bad with a fixed blade. There you see 100% flat, no gaps anywhere whatsoever, and that, my friends, is exactly how it should look.
Are you as horny as I am?
Now it's time to start marking up the blade so I know where I'm going to grind in the bevels. Using Dykem layout fluid, you just wipe it on. They have a spray version as well. They also have a dauber version. Think of your grandma's bingo dauber thingier. I used to use those. I thought they were the greatest thing in the world till I squeezed one too hard one day and the dauber came out and all of the Dykem exploded all over me, the floor, my benches. it was a nightmare. And it was red, so it looked like I had just slaughtered a small child or a midget. I think it'd be better to think of slaughtering midgets in my shop than small children. Little people, I'm sorry, we don't say midget anymore. Anyway, so Dykem fluid, use whichever type you like. Once that dries, it allows me to scribe my marks with a carbide scribe, or the carbide tips on my calipers is actually what I'm going to be doing here. And that allows me to mark the bevels so that I have the exact same height on both sides of the blade. Gives me a gauge as to how far I'm grinding. So here I'm going to mark my primary bevel. And you don't have to carve in super hard. All you're doing is making a mark through a layer of paint, essentially. So there's that. You can even use a Sharpie. I've used a Sharpie in a pinch if I was out of Dicam fluid. One thing that you'll notice is the smoother and finer your finish work is, the less the Dicam wants to adhere to it. So sometimes you'll go to scribe this, and it'll tear out big chunks of the Dicam and just peel it off because it's not adhering very well. That's extremely aggravating. Now, marking the top side there, that's where my swedges are going to be. And I want to keep everything as close to these scribe lines as I can. I'll always end up measuring with my calipers as I'm grinding, just to make sure I'm where I need to be. So now once I've done that, I can now put the layout fluid on the edge so I can scribe my center line. Can't do that first because as I'm running the calipers to do the bevel lines, it'll actually start scratching at the edge. So it'll tear off anything that I've marked. So I've learned to do that after I've marked my bevels. Now, normally, this is the part where I clean up my granite surface plate. As I mentioned, that glue is very easy to get off. I just pour a little bit of lacquer thinner on there, and I can wipe it off. And what you'll always do, anytime you clean your surface plate, you'll always go over it afterwards with your hand, just so you can feel the teeniest, tiniest little thing that may be there. Remember, these things are scientifically accurate to be flat. You're paying for that. So any tiny little bit of, backside glue or anything like that from PSA tape or anything could have a bump on there and change something by a couple hundred thousandths. And you don't want that. Here's where I realized my battery was dead in my height gauge. And the height gauge, the way this one's set up, it's not accurate to use manually. You have to rely on it digitally. So here I am doing it the old-fashioned way. I'm just going to measure the thickness. I measure at the heel of the edge, I measure at the center of the edge, and I measure at the tip, just to make sure again that everything is perfectly flat and true. And there I'll take the measurement, I'll cut it in half, I'll set up my calipers to that half size measurement, and I'll just use the carbide tips on there and zip right down the center, flip it over, do it down the center again, and each of those lines are as far as I want to go down on each bevel. That way I've got a perfectly thick edge when I'm done. So it's not easy to see, but I'll try to give you a close-up here. Oh no, Jim, you use a jig. You bet your ass I do. I want repeatability, and I want things to go as smoothly as possible. When I prototype a knife, I always freehand grind those because I'm going to make adjustments here and there, because I'm going to experiment with different kinds of grinds and grind heights and different plunges and things of that nature as I'm developing a new model. Once I've got it down, I'll go back and I'll use a jig. If I freehand a knife that I'm making, I'll go back on the final passes for the finish with the jig. Because again, I want my lines, I want my bevels, I want my grinds to be as smooth and perfect as they possibly can be. Here, I don't use a file guide for my plunges. I just draw a line with a Sharpie, and I know that's my start point for my plunges, or my termination point, as it were. Now, when you're doing sweeping plunges, I'm going to have two. I'm going to have my working plunge, as I call it, which is that first line, and there's a line back there in the finger choil. That is the termination of when I'm going to be sweeping my plunges and pulling them back. So that's just how I do sweeping plunges. That may not be how you do your sweeping plunges. Why do sweeping plunges? I do it because it's a great way, honestly, of showing off your skill. Anybody can do square plunges. I don't want to say anybody. It still takes a while to learn the symmetry and get your plunges perfectly even. And they really don't have to be 100% dead on perfectly even. I like the fact that I can tell a hand ground blade because there's always a little tiny deviance. But doing sweeping plunges is far, far more challenging, and you can end up chasing those plunges to get them right where they both look the same, to the point where you've pulled them back so far that you no longer have a useful knife. So I prefer sweeping plunges. They're sexier. There's a lot more drama in the final product. I like it a hell of a lot more. So here I am just starting with the plunges. Doing a recurve is different than doing any other style of blade. Yes, the jig will help you keep the same angle, but it doesn't help you do anything else. You can still burn up the edge, you can still burn your tips off, you can still use too much pressure, you can still push on that jig in the wrong way and change the angle. As you get into your finer belts, if you push in too hard, it's gonna change the angle. And there's a lot of different things, even though you've got a jig, that you still have to do everything that you do freehand. The only difference is it's just holding it in position. Now my jig is 90 degrees. It's not adjustable. Why? Because my work rest is adjustable, because what I'm using here for my flat platen is the Moen tooling, the Moen Works intercooled rotary carbide platen. So it runs cooler than a standard steel platen. The platen itself is carbide, so it doesn't wear away like steel does. So it lasts pretty much forever. And then it has a rubber belt running over that, which allows me to jump a lot. I'm going to go here from a 36 grit belt, which is what I'm using. I'm going to jump to a 120. I can actually jump to a 220, which you would not ever be able to do with a regular steel flat platen. It also allows me to use every belt that there is, just like hollow grinding, because I don't get belt bump. I can go up all the way into 3,000 grit belts and grind with it, which you cannot do on a flat platen. You really can't go over 220 grit on a flat platen because the belt bump is going to start digging into your bevels and really, really screw up your grinds terribly. Yes, this is expensive. This attachment's over $3,000. His new one that he just redesigned is a little bit less. I think it's like $2,500 if I'm not mistaken. But it runs cooler. I don't have to quench or dunk my blade as often in water. It is much more efficient. I can run at a higher speed if I choose to. And I don't have to use nearly as many belts. I can go from 36 to 220 to 600 to 1,000. Boom. Instead of doing 36, 60, 120, 220, 400, 600, 800, 1,000. So yeah, this is a game-changing attachment. So what I'm basically doing, I use my air compressor a lot. I will always blow the water and any debris off of my blade after I've dunked it, and I'll always blow off my surface area because I don't want any buildup of the steel dust, because that very tiny little bit can change the angle. Always go gentle on your tips. Always, always, always. Now you see I've already ground one side of this, so now I'm going to use less pressure on the second side because now you have less steel. So now it's going to heat up twice as fast as the first side did. And if you heat up to the point where that steel changes color, you have blown through your temper and the knife will never ever hold an edge. You can put whatever edge you want to on there, somebody will cut with it a handful of times and it's going to get dull. They'll resharpen it, it'll get dull again. So you don't ever want to blow your temper. This is why custom knife making by hand is as difficult as it is in what you're paying for. You're paying for the ultimate in precision, and you're paying for that knife maker to have the knowledge to grind your knife to not ruin the heat treat. Whether you heat treat yourself or you send it out to Peters or Boz or whoever else, I enjoy heat treating now that I have my own heat treat oven. I've been doing it for a couple of years now. But it doesn't matter who heat treats it. You don't want to ruin that work by burning through that steel. I'm treating the tip grind separate from the rest of the grind. I only do that in the beginning. As I go to finish the knife, I blend the two together so that it's seamless. You won't see a line like you would in a traditional Tanto. My knife, the Hellraiser, is actually a recurve tanto with a harpoon. But I don't grind it like I grind a standard tanto, where you grind the tip and then you grind the other primary bevel. I do them separately in the beginning because I want to set how far back that angled tip grind goes, so I get the diamond right on the spine of the blade. So once I've achieved that and gotten it down where I need it to be, then I'm going to start, you'll start seeing me rock right there. You'll start seeing me rock around where the belly of the blade is. That's so I can blend those two together. There's no difference in thickness between those grinds, so it's all one continuous grind. Once I get it to where I want it, from then on, then I do it as one continuous grind going all the way around. I'm going to do it for the 36 grit grinding. I only do about 90% of the height of the bevels with the 36 grit. My plunges are mostly even. They're pretty good. Remember, that's just the starting plunge, my working plunge. That's going to change later. I'm going to pull them back with the sweeping plunges. Now we're going to go to the 120 and refine the grinds that I just did, and I'm going to climb them up a little bit. The reason I stopped so short on the 36 is, again, the same thing I've mentioned earlier. You've got these big giant chunks of grit in that belt. Remember, I've already laid in my final finish on the flats. So what I don't want is one random large chunk of grit in my belt to go up and cut into my flats. I'm going to slow down the belt a little bit here because it's a higher grit. It causes more friction. So I wanted to hog away a bunch of material before. Now I don't. Now I'm going to start pulling that plunge back with the sweeping plunges, and I do that with my 120. You can't do it in one motion because you're going to start burning up the blade because it causes way too much friction, and you're applying quite a bit of pressure here to sweep it in. I'm trying to zoom in a little bit so you can see a little bit of how I do it. The way I learned, the way it was described to me, I learned from my good friend Todd Begg how to do sweeping plunges because he is one of the masters of them. Just think of landing a plane. You're coming in gently, 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 and you're sweeping down, and then you're going down to where the rest of your bevel is. So that's something that you can say, but unless you're standing there with somebody, you can't teach them how to do sweeping plunges. I taught a good friend of mine, Trevor, how to do them. He came to my shop one day. Within a half hour, he nailed it, and that's all he does now is these beautiful sweeping plunges. So there it is. It's sweeping in nicely. So a sweeping plunge done properly does two things. It gives you that soft radius at the rear of the grind, which is your plunge. So the top of it won't be a 90-degree corner or anything, so it's going to be radiused. It's also going to sweep in from the full thickness of the blade stock gently down to the thinness of the edge. So that's the proper sweeping plunge. Not a lot of makers do it. I'd say probably less than 20% of all your high-end makers actually do a sweeping plunge. Go look at the knives in your collection. Most are going to be pretty straight, and they're going to be, you know, kind of have a little bit of a corner where they meet. So here with my 120 grit belt, I've brought the plunges back into the sweep, radiused the plunge, and smoothed out all of the 36 grit lines that I had before, and my bevel line has raised a little bit. So now, I no longer am in danger. There's what 36 looks like on the other side. There's what the 120 looks like. I'm no longer in danger of chopping into my beautifully finished flats with that rough 36 grit belt. So yeah, you definitely want to, you don't want to go all the way up to where you've marked your grind lines or your bevel lines with that really rough 36 or 60 grit belt. Never, ever, ever do that. Because then you're just going to have to go back and go back over your flats and hope that you're able to do it right. So now I'm going to start working on the other side, getting rid of the 36 grit lines, smoothing them out to 120, and bringing the bevel lines up and sweeping my plunge. As I'm sweeping it, I'm coming back into the finger choil. There it is, starting to go back a little bit. I've got the radius in there, but I don't have the sweep exactly how I want it, and the plunge lines are a little bit off. One is further back than the other. They're also dropping in at a different rate. So All that requires fine tuning. I'll fine tune it with 120, sometimes 220, and then the final bit I'll do with whatever my finish grit is going to be on this knife. Did I stop at 400 or 600? I think I stopped at 400 on this knife. We'll see here in a few minutes. But whatever that final grit was, that's where I did the final touch-up to make sure the plunges were as close to being perfect as possible and were sweeping in the same manner, and everything was nice and clean and smooth. There we go. I'm going to kind of back it in a little bit on the tip there. When you're grinding and you're going from your plunge to the tip, you never want to bring your tip past the halfway point of your belt, because you'll burn that tip right up and actually burn it off. And a lot of times you'll kind of want to back it in, because you can use a little bit of pressure and hit the exact angle that you want when the blade is cold, and you're going to bring the heat back into thicker areas of the knife that can tolerate it better. So it just depends on what your comfort level is. And here we are cleaning it up more, cleaning up that plunge a little more, just to get it to match the other side. I'm pulling it up constantly to look at my plunges to try to get them as symmetrical as I can. And this knife, they were not 100% perfect when I was done, but they are very, 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 very close to where, yeah, you could tell it was done by hand, but it looks really good. Now we're going to go to the 400 grit. And this, I'm going to slow down the grinder again, and I'm going to apply almost no pressure. I'm going to let the belt do the work. This 400 grit, you could fart, and in that split second, you could burn up the temper. So I'm going to bring my VFD down to about 20 or a little bit below, so the belt is barely running. It's also, again, running cooler than a standard flat platen because of the platen that I use. So if you're using a regular steel platen, well, you wouldn't be with a 400 grit belt. You can't do it. It'll look just awful. But you would want to slow down your VFD even more to do this. So now I'm going to very carefully go into that plunge area, and you'll see I'm going to go all the way to the tip, and then I'm going to clean it back up, going back in reverse. Some people claim that you can do sweeping plunges by hanging your belt off the platen a little bit and backing into it. Yeah, I guess you can, but you're not going to get the right pressure for consistency because the belt's hanging off the platen. You got to hope that it's going to do what it needs to do. I don't rely on that. I need to use my hands, and I need to feel it. I need to know the pressure that belt is applying at all times. So there is a perfectly swept plunge. There are perfectly clean 400 grit lines going down the entire bevel. I always use fresh belts. Always, always, always for those finishing grits. Never reuse a belt. Now that belt will never touch a bevel ever again. It's going to get put in a pile to be used for working on scales and working on cleaning up parameters and stuff on other knives. That belt will never touch another bevel, because any little bit of buildup that's in there could cause one little area to have a slightly deeper scratch mark than the rest. And when you look at my satin grinds, and I'll show them to you at the end when this is done, everything should be perfectly smooth. It should almost look like velvet, and it should reflect almost like a rainbow effect going through the blade when the light dances across it. That's something I take a lot of pride on. If the knife is ordered with a belt satin finish, I take pride in having that perfect flawless finish even on a grinder. Yes, if you were hand rubbing the blade, wouldn't matter as much, because you're going to take that out with die maker stones and sandpaper when you do it, when you do the hand rub satin. To me, I love doing a hand rub satin on the flats where they're going horizontal, and I have vertical lines in the bevels, and those lines are smooth and velvety and perfect. To me, it shows the skill of the maker on the grinder. It's funny, from being a collector as long as I have been, then making the jump into knife making, once I got to the point where I'd gone through my growing pains and I learned about better finishing and bettered myself in grinding, I would go back and look through my collection of knives I paid $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 for, and I'd see where their bevels were not ground as smoothly because they didn't have the same care. They didn't use their air compressor and blow off dirty grits off the belt, and maybe they used a worn belt, and there'd be shinier areas of the grind than in other areas, or you'd have a couple of scratch marks that were noticeably deeper than the rest of the bevel, and I will not allow that to happen. Even if it's in my final pass at the end of the knife and I see that, I'll go back and regrind it, because to me, I have a great pride in the belt satin finishes on my bevels. I love how they look when they come out right. And believe me, I fuck up a lot, and there's a lot of frustrating moments.